Imagine a coastline where the boundary between worlds grows thin as mist. Not the bright, tourist-filled beaches of summer postcards, but the raw, ancient shores of Scotland and Ireland, where black rocks thrust from grey water, and the wind carries voices that might be seals, or might be something else entirely. Here, in the liminal spaces where tide meets stone, where foam dissolves into sand, the impossible becomes inevitable. This is where the Selkie dwells, neither fully of the sea nor of the land, existing in that terrible, beautiful space between. Welcome to Echoes of the Old World, where we peel back the layers of myth to reveal the beating heart of human truth beneath. If you're drawn to stories that haunt as much as they illuminate, stories that refuse easy answers and demand you confront uncomfortable questions, then you've found your home. Subscribe now, because what we're about to explore will challenge everything you think you know about love, freedom, and the chains we forge in the name of both. Before we dive deeper into these dark waters, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, and whether you've ever heard whispers of the Selkie in your own corner of the world. This is a conversation, not a lecture, and your voice matters in keeping these ancient stories alive. The Selkie is not a monster in any conventional sense. She bears no fangs, wields no curse, threatens no village with fire or plague. Her tragedy is quieter, deeper, more devastating than any dragon's rampage. She is, at her core, a being of pure duality, a seal in the ocean's embrace, a woman of haunting beauty on the shore. The mechanism of her transformation is deceptively simple, yet it carries the weight of existence itself. She wears her seal skin in the water, and when she emerges onto land, she can shed it like a coat, revealing the human form beneath. But this skin is not mere clothing. It is identity itself, belonging itself, the very essence of what she is. Without it, she is trapped in a form that, however beautiful, will always be a prison. The legends that cluster around Scotland's northern islands, the Orkney and Shetland archipelagos, and the wind-swept Outer Hebrides, speak of the Selkie with a reverence that borders on terror. Not the terror of immediate violence, but something far more unsettling. The terror of loss that cannot be prevented, of love that cannot be sustained, of freedom that will always, inevitably, triumph over captivity. These are not stories designed to entertain children by the fireside, though they have been told that way for centuries. They are warnings, encoded memories, and perhaps most disturbingly, they are mirrors held up to the darkest impulses of human desire. In the old tongue of the Orcadians, in the Gaelic whispers of the Hebrides, in the Norse-tinged speech of Shetland, the pattern repeats with the consistency of waves against stone. A fisherman, lonely and hardened by the sea's cruelty, walks a moonlit beach. Perhaps he cannot sleep, haunted by storms, or debts, or simple isolation. Perhaps he is hunting seals for their oil and fur, already a predator before the transformation occurs. And then he sees them, seals emerging from the waves, dozens of them, moving with uncanny purpose toward a hidden cove. He follows, drawn by curiosity or fate, or something older than both. What he witnesses will determine the trajectory of his entire life and destroy another's. The seals shed their skins. Beneath the sleek, spotted pelts, human forms emerge, men and women of such extraordinary beauty that the fisherman's breath catches in his throat. They dance on the sand. They sing in voices that seem to contain the entire vocabulary of longing. They move with a grace that no fully human body could achieve. They are joy incarnate, freedom made flesh, belonging made visible. And the fisherman, watching from shadow, makes the choice that will echo through generations. He sees one woman, perhaps the most beautiful, perhaps simply the most vulnerable, and he decides that she will be his. He creeps forward while the Selkie folk are lost in their revels, and he steals her skin. This is not romance. Let us be absolutely clear from the beginning. This is theft. This is the seizure of agency, the deliberate destruction of autonomy, the calculated imprisonment of a conscious being. But in the old stories, this moment is often glossed over, softened, made palatable. The fisherman is portrayed as lonely, as deserving of love, as simply taking what the sea has offered. The Selkie, when she discovers her skin is gone, is described as accepting her fate with grace, as making the best of an impossible situation, as even growing to love her captor over time. But if you listen closely to these tales, if you pay attention to what is said between the words, you hear something else entirely. The sound of a prison door closing, and a creature of wild freedom beginning the long, slow process of suffocation. The Selkie, skinless and stranded, has no choice. She cannot return to the sea in human form. She would drown like any other mortal woman. She cannot survive alone on these harsh coasts without shelter or protection. And so, when the fisherman emerges from hiding, holding her skin like a trophy, like a leash, like a wedding gift, she does what she must to survive. She agrees to be his wife. She walks with him to his cottage. She crosses the threshold into captivity, and the door closes behind her with the finality of a grave being filled. But her eyes, every account agrees, remain fixed on the horizon, on the line where sea meets sky, on the world she has lost, and will spend every remaining moment trying to reclaim. To understand the Selkie, you must first understand the skin, not as metaphor, though it functions powerfully as one, but as the literal physical object that defines her existence. The seal skin is described across hundreds of years of testimony with remarkable consistency. Sleek and spotted, grey or brown, or sometimes a deep charcoal that seems to absorb light. It is supple beyond any tanned leather, warm to the touch even when wet, and it carries the smell of the deep ocean, that peculiar mixture of salt and cold and something ancient that no land dweller can quite name. When the Selkie wears it, she is utterly seal, moving through water with a grace and power that makes human swimming look like clumsy thrashing. She can dive to depths that would crush human lungs, hold her breath for spans of time that defy mammalian biology, navigate by senses we cannot begin to comprehend. But the skin is more than a tool for transformation. It is, in the truest and most literal sense, her soul made manifest. This is not poetic exaggeration. The folklore is explicit on this point. The Selkie without her skin is incomplete, severed from her true, existing in a state of fundamental wrongness that can never be corrected by time or love, or even willful forgetting. She may walk on two legs, speak human language, bear human children, and perform every function of a mortal woman with flawless competence. Yet beneath it all, in the marrow of her bones and the electricity of her nerves, she remains seal. The skin calls to her with a voice more compelling than any human speech, more insistent than hunger or thirst, or the need for air itself. The transformation itself is described as both effortless and profound. When the Selkie emerges from the waves and reaches the privacy of a hidden cove or sea cave, she grasps the edge of the skin at her throat. Some accounts describe a seam that becomes visible only when she wills it. Others suggest the skin simply loosens in response to intention. She pulls it back over her head and shoulders, peeling it away from her body like a garment. though the process seems to involve more than mere removal of clothing. As the skin comes away, the seal form dissolves, reshapes, reorganizes itself according to laws that predate human understanding of physics or biology. What emerges is a woman of such beauty that witnesses struggle to find adequate words. This beauty is not the conventional prettiness of human standards, though the Selkie certainly possesses symmetry and grace in abundance. It is something else entirely, a beauty that carries the weight of the wild, untamed ocean. Her skin, now bare and human, seems to glow with an inner luminescence, pale as foam, or sometimes touched with the grey-green of deep water. Her hair flows in shades that shift between dark seal brown and the silver of moonlight on waves, impossibly thick and long, carrying the texture of silk and the faint scent of brine. Her eyes are perhaps the most unsettling feature, large and dark and liquid, reflecting light in ways that human eyes do not, holding depths that suggest intelligence far older and stranger than our own. When she moves, even in human form, there is a fluidity that seems to defy skeletal structure, a grace that belongs to the ocean's currents rather than to land-bound bipedal locomotion. The seal's skin, once removed, must be hidden or guarded with absolute vigilance. This is not optional, not a casual preference, but an iron law that governs Selkie existence. If the skin is lost or stolen, the Selkie cannot return to seal form. She is trapped, exiled from her true home, severed from her people and her element. The ocean that once welcomed her would become her grave. She would drown as helplessly as any human woman, her seal lungs and seal instincts locked away inside the stolen skin, unreachable and useless. This vulnerability is the crack in her armor, the single point of failure that makes her captivity possible. It is why the Selkie folk hide their skins so carefully during their brief visits to land, why they post sentries, why they choose isolated coves known only to their kind. The rules governing the skin are ancient and absolute. A Selkie may give her skin to another voluntarily, though this is described as an act of profound trust equivalent to offering one's life. If the skin is freely given, it can be freely reclaimed. But if the skin is stolen, as it so often is in these tales, different laws apply. The thief gains a terrible power over the Selkie, not through magic in the conventional sense, but through the simple, brutal logic of hostage-taking. She must bargain for its return, must negotiate with her captor, must often agree to marriage or servitude, or whatever price the thief demands. Some versions of the legend suggest that if she can find the hidden skin herself, she is released from any obligation to the thief. Others claim that the theft creates a binding that can only be broken by death. All agree on one fundamental truth: the Selkie will never stop searching, never stop longing, never truly belong to the land or to the man who holds her captive. This is the anatomy of her prison. A beautiful body that feels wrong, a human life that can never satisfy, and somewhere nearby, hidden in a locked chest or beneath floorboards or in the rafters of a barn, the skin that contains everything she truly is. Every day she remains on land is a day spent in exile. Every night she lies beside her captor is a night of captivity. And every moment, waking or sleeping, she is planning, searching, waiting for the opportunity to reclaim what was stolen and return to the sea that is her only true home. The night is midsummer, though in these northern latitudes, summer means only a softening of winter's brutality, not true warmth. The moon hangs full and heavy over the water, casting a path of silver light across the waves that seems solid enough to walk upon. This is the time when the boundary between worlds grows thinnest, when the Selkie folk feel the pull to visit the land of their distant ancestors. to remember what it means to stand on two legs and breathe air that burns with its richness. They come in groups, never alone, always protecting one another against the dangers they know wait in the darkness beyond the tide line. Our fisherman, let us call him Magnus, has been walking these shores since sunset. He is perhaps 30 years old, weathered beyond his years by salt and wind, and the particular loneliness that comes from a life lived at the mercy of the sea. His wife died 2 winters past, taken by fever, leaving him with a stone cottage that echoes with absence and a bed too large for one body. He tells himself he walks for insomnia's sake, that the crash of waves helps quiet the thoughts that swarm like gulls around carrion. But in truth, he walks because he has heard the stories, the whispers in the pub when the old men drink too much and their tongues loosen with memory. He walks because he is hunting. He sees them from a distance at first, dark shapes pulling themselves onto a hidden stretch of beach, protected by tall rocks that form a natural barrier. He knows this place, has fished off these rocks since boyhood, but he has never come here at night during the full moon. Now he understands why the old men spoke of it with that particular tone, half reverence and half warning. He moves closer, keeping to shadows, stepping carefully to avoid loose stones that might betray his presence. His heart hammers against his ribs with a mixture of fear and anticipation, and something darker that he does not care to examine too closely. From his hiding place behind a salt-warm boulder, he witnesses the transformation. The seals, more than 20 of them, haul themselves fully onto the sand. They are large specimens, sleek and healthy, their spotted coats glistening in the moonlight. And then, as if responding to a signal he cannot perceive, they begin to shed their skins. The process is fluid, almost casual, like women removing shawls after returning home from the cold. The skins fold back, are carefully set aside on the rocks above the tide line, and beneath them emerge forms that make Magnus forget to breathe. They are men and women both, though Magnus finds his attention drawn inexorably to the women. They are naked as the day of their birth, but there is nothing vulnerable in their nakedness. They move with absolute confidence, laughing and singing, in a language that sounds like water over stones, like wind through sea caves, like nothing human and yet somehow comprehensible in its emotional content. They dance on the sand, their feet leaving prints that will be erased by morning's tide. They dive and surface in the shallow water, playing like children, like seals, like beings who have never known the weight of human worry or human shame. One woman captures his attention completely. She is not the tallest or the most conventionally beautiful, but there is something in the way she moves, the way her dark hair streams behind her like kelp in current, the way her laughter rises above the others with a clarity that pierces straight to his chest. He watches her spin and leap, watches her embrace her companions, watches her throw her head back to sing at the moon. And in that moment, Magnus makes a choice that will poison the rest of his life and end hers as she knows it. He decides that she will be his wife. He waits with the patience learned from years of fishing, watching for the moment when the revels reach their peak and attention is directed away from the carefully arranged skins. The Selkie folk are not careless. They post watchers. They remain vigilant even in joy. But they are also trusting of their own kind, and they do not expect a human to be so bold, so foolish, or so cruel. When the moment comes, a brief gap in attention as some disturbance in the water draws every eye seaward, Magnus moves with the speed of a hunting seal himself. He crosses the distance in heartbeats, snatches the skin he has been watching, the one he knows belongs to her, and retreats back into shadow. The skin in his hands is warm, impossibly soft, and it seems to pulse with a life of its own. For a moment, holding it, he feels a connection to something vast and ancient, a consciousness that is utterly alien and yet somehow familiar. The skin wants to return to its owner. It strains in his grip like a living thing, and he has to clutch it tightly to prevent it from slipping away. He bundles it under his coat, holding it against his chest, where it beats in rhythm with his own racing heart. Then he settles down to wait for the inevitable discovery. It comes with the turning of the tide. The Selkie folk, sensing dawn's approach, return to their skins. One by one, they transform, sliding back into their seal forms with visible relief, as if returning home after a long journey. But one woman searches frantically among the rocks, her movements becoming increasingly desperate. She calls out in that water language, and her companions join the search, but the skin is gone. Magnus watches her face as understanding dawns, watches hope curdle into horror, watches her sink to her knees on the sand as her people gather around her. They know what has happened. They know what it means. And they know, as she knows, that there is nothing they can do. The laws that govern their kind forbid them from staying past dawn. They cannot risk themselves for one, no matter how beloved. With gestures of sorrow that need no translation, they leave her, sliding into the waves one by one until she is alone on the beach in human form, naked and stranded and utterly forsaken. Magnus emerges from the shadows as dawn bleeds grey light across the water. He carries his own coat, which he drapes over the Selkie woman's shoulders with a gentleness that might be mistaken for kindness if you did not know what he carries hidden beneath his own shirt. She does not resist when he touches her, does not flee or fight or even speak. She simply stands there on the cold sand, shivering despite the coat, her eyes fixed on the retreating waves where her people have vanished. He speaks to her in the soft tones one might use with a frightened animal, tells her his name, tells her she will be safe with him, tells her a series of lies that they both know are lies, but that must be spoken nonetheless to maintain the pretense of civilization. He leads her to his cottage, and she follows like a sleepwalker, her bare feet leaving bloody prints on the rocky path. Inside, he gives her clothes that belong to his dead wife, garments that hang strangely on her frame because her proportions are subtly wrong for human fashion, her shoulders too broad from a life of swimming, her waist too narrow, her movements too fluid for the restrictive fabric. She accepts them without comment, dresses herself with mechanical precision, and then sits by the cold hearth staring at nothing. Magnus builds up the fire, prepares food, talks at her about his life and his loneliness and his certainty that they will be happy together. She does not respond. She barely seems to breathe. But when he finally asks her name, she answers in a voice like waves on shingle, Moira. The years that follow create the shape of a marriage. Moira learns the routines of human domesticity with eerie perfection, as if she has studied the role and determined to perform it flawlessly. She keeps the cottage cleaner than Magnus ever managed alone, scrubbing floors until they shine, washing clothes until they are blindingly white, preparing meals with the precision of ritual. She tends the small vegetable garden, mends his fishing nets, darns his socks, and performs every duty expected of a fisherman's wife with quiet efficiency. To the neighbours who eventually meet her, she appears as the ideal spouse, beautiful, dutiful, soft-spoken, and devoted. They congratulate Magnus on his good fortune, whisper among themselves about where he found such a woman, but ultimately accept the story he tells about a widow from a distant island seeking a new start. But those who look closely see the wrongness. Moira moves through her days like a ghost going through the motions of life, present in body but absent in spirit. She speaks when spoken to, but never initiates conversation. She smiles when appropriate, but the expression never reaches her eyes. Those eyes remain dark and liquid and far away, always turned toward windows that face the sea, always tracking the flight of gulls, always listening to sounds that others cannot hear. She performs affection when required, allows Magnus into her bed, tolerates his touch with a passivity that he mistakes for acceptance. But there is no warmth in her compliance, no genuine connection, only the blank cooperation of a prisoner who has learned that resistance changes nothing. The neighbours notice other oddities. Moira will not eat fish, refuses it with a vehemence that seems out of proportion to simple dietary preference. She cannot bear to be away from windows, grows agitated and silent if forced into inner rooms. She keeps the cottage frigidly cold, opening windows even in winter, and she bathes obsessively, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day, as if trying to wash away the contamination of land itself. She hums constantly while she works, not human melodies, but something older, rhythmic patterns that sound like tide and current. And she hoards salt, keeps bowls of it throughout the cottage, runs her fingers through it as if the crystals connect her to the ocean she has lost. Magnus tells himself that she is adjusting, that given time, she will forget her old life and embrace her new one. He is kind to her by his own standards, does not beat her as some men beat their wives, provides for her material needs, and expects only what any husband might expect. He even grows to genuinely care for her in his limited way, feels pride when neighbours compliment her beauty, experiences something like tenderness when he watches her sleep. But he also keeps the sealskin hidden, moves it periodically to new locations, checks on it compulsively to ensure it remains secure. He has locked it in an iron-bound chest buried beneath the floor of his workshop, a place Moira never enters, and he carries the only key on a chain around his neck that he never removes, not even when sleeping. At night, when he believes she sleeps, Moira lies awake listening to the sound of waves against rocks. She has mapped every inch of the cottage in her systematic search, has checked every possible hiding place she can access without raising suspicion. She knows the skin is not in the house proper, knows it must be in the workshop or buried somewhere on the property. But Magnus is too vigilant, too suspicious of her movements near his workspace. She has tried asking for it directly, tried bargaining, tried pleading, but he only shakes his head and tells her she will thank him someday for saving her from a cold and dangerous life. He genuinely believes this. He has convinced himself that he rescued her, that she is better off as his wife than as a seal in the ocean, that his love justifies his crime. So, Moira waits. She performs her role with flawless precision, never giving him reason to increase his vigilance, never letting him see the desperation that gnaws at her like hunger. She learns human patience to accompany her human form, learns to think in terms of years rather than tides. She knows that someday, somehow, his attention will slip. He will grow complacent, will forget to be cautious, will make the mistake that all captors eventually make. And when that moment comes, she will be ready. She will reclaim what was stolen. She will return to the sea, no matter how long it takes, no matter what price she must pay, no matter what she must leave behind. Because she is not human, will never be human. And every day on land is another day of slow suffocation in a world that will never truly be hers. 3 years into captivity, Moira discovers she is pregnant. The realization comes not with joy, but with a cold, sinking dread that settles in her chest like a stone. She knows what this means, understands the implications with a clarity that makes her want to walk into the sea and let the waves take her, skin or no skin. A child will bind her to this life in ways that mere marriage vows cannot. A child will give Magnus another hostage, another chain, another reason to never return what he has stolen. And yet, despite her horror, despite her rage, despite every instinct screaming that this is wrong, her body continues the process it has begun, building a life from the joining of seal and human, creating something that should not exist, and yet inevitably does. When Magnus learns of the pregnancy, his joy is absolute and unfeigned. He sees it as proof that Moira has accepted her new life, evidence that she is becoming truly his. He grows even more attentive, more protective, hovering over her with a solicitude that feels like surveillance. He brings her special foods from the village, insists she rest more, talks endlessly about the child they will raise together and the family they are becoming. Moira listens to his plans with the same distant courtesy she brings to all their interactions. But inside, she is calculating. A child changes everything. A child makes escape infinitely more complicated. But a child might also make Magnus careless, might distract him enough for her to finally find her skin. The birth comes in winter, as harsh and unforgiving as everything else in this northern land. Moira labours for 2 days, attended by the village midwife who clucks and frets over her unusual silence, the way she refuses to cry out no matter how intense the contractions become. When the child finally emerges, it is a girl, perfect in form but marked with subtle signs of her dual heritage. Her eyes are too large, too dark, with that same liquid quality as her mother's. Her fingers and toes are slightly webbed, barely noticeable, but unmistakable to anyone who knows what to look for. And when she cries, the sound carries an eerie quality, almost like the call of a seal pup separated from its mother. Magnus names her Kenna, and from the moment he holds her, he is transformed by a love so fierce it borders on obsession. He dotes on his daughter with an intensity that surprises even himself, spends hours simply watching her sleep, carries her everywhere when she's old enough, tells her stories about the sea and the creatures that live there, never knowing the bitter irony of his choice of tales. Moira watches this love develop with conflicted emotions she cannot fully untangle. She resents the child for making her captivity more complete, hates that this tiny being has become another lock on her cage. And yet, when she holds Kenna, when she nurses her and feels the small body relax into sleep against her chest, she experiences something she did not expect, a fierce, protective tenderness that terrifies her with its strength. As Kenna grows, the markers of her heritage become more pronounced. She learns to walk later than human children, but when she finally does, her balance is uncanny, perfect even on the slick rocks by the shore. She is drawn to water with a compulsion that frightens Magnus, will strip off her clothes and wade into the ocean given any opportunity, can hold her breath underwater for lengths of time that should be impossible for a child her age. She barely speaks until she is nearly 4 years old. And when she does finally talk, her first words are in a language neither parent taught her, sounds that echo the water speech of the Selkie folk. Moira hears her daughter singing the old songs, melodies she should have no way of knowing, and understands that blood carries memory deeper than conscious teaching. 2 years after Kenna, another child arrives, a son this time, whom Magnus names Callum. He too bears the marks, the webbing between fingers and toes, the oversized eyes, the strange affinity for water, and the uncanny ability to hold his breath. With 2 children, Moira's prison becomes complete. She cannot imagine fleeing with 2 small ones in tow, cannot picture taking them into the sea where they would drown despite their partial heritage, cannot abandon them even though they represent everything that keeps her trapped. Magnus knows this, relies on it, grows more confident in his possession of her with each passing year and each new child. The children adore their mother with an intensity that goes beyond normal filial attachment. They follow her constantly, grow distressed when separated from her, seem to sense her fundamental otherness and respond to it with instinctive recognition. Kenna especially watches Moira with eyes that seem far too knowing for her age. She asks questions that no child should think to ask. Why does mother hum those particular songs? Why does she stare at the sea for hours? Why does she never seem truly happy, even when she smiles? Moira deflects these questions with practiced skill, but she knows her daughter sees through the performance, recognizes the captivity, even if she lacks the vocabulary to name it. The cruelest aspect of motherhood, Moira discovers, is that it creates genuine love even in the midst of imprisonment. She loves her children fiercely, would die to protect them, feels her heart contract with tenderness when Kenna brings her flowers, or Callum falls asleep in her lap. This love does not erase her longing for the sea, does not make her captivity acceptable, does not transform her into a willing participant in Magnus's domestic fantasy. But it does complicate everything, adds layers of moral weight to every decision, makes the simple choice between freedom and captivity into an impossible equation with no acceptable solution. She is bound now, not just by the theft of her skin, but by bonds of blood and milk and maternal devotion that are, in their own way, just as unbreakable and far more insidious because they are forged by her own heart rather than imposed by force. The search begins on the first day of captivity and never truly ends. It becomes the background rhythm of Moira's existence, the constant undertone beneath every domestic task, every conversation, every moment of apparent normalcy. She searches with the systematic patience of tide wearing down stone, knowing that Magnus has hidden her skin somewhere within reach but beyond her grasp, and that finding it requires not just luck, but perfect timing, absolute discretion, and a level of strategic thinking that must span years rather than days. She cannot simply tear the cottage apart in desperate frenzy. Such obvious searching would only make Magnus more vigilant, would lead him to move the skin to an even more secure location, might even drive him to destroy it in a fit of possessive rage. So she searches slowly, carefully, turning her captivity into a long game of patience and deception. In the early years, before the children arrive, Moira systematically investigates every space she can access without arousing suspicion. She searches while cleaning, using her domestic duties as cover to examine floorboards for signs of disturbance, to check behind furniture for hidden compartments, to tap walls listening for hollow spaces. She memorizes the geography of the cottage with absolute precision, noting which boards creak, which stones in the fireplace are loose, which rafters might conceal a wrapped bundle. She develops elaborate mental maps, crossing off possibilities one by one, narrowing down the locations where the skin might be hidden. But she finds nothing. The cottage yields no secrets despite her exhaustive investigation. The workshop becomes her obsession because it is the one place Magnus explicitly forbids her to enter. He claims it is for her safety, says the tools are dangerous and the space too cluttered for a woman's presence. But Moira knows the truth with cold certainty. The skin is there, must be there, hidden in that locked building where he spends hours supposedly mending nets and repairing gear. She watches the workshop from windows, studies Magnus's patterns of entry and exit, notes that he always locks the door behind him, even when he will return in moments. She sees him check his coat pocket compulsively before leaving, touching something there with the nervous gesture of a man guarding treasure. The key, she realizes. He carries the key to the workshop, probably on his person at all times. For months, she considers ways to access the workshop. She imagines waiting until Magnus sleeps and searching his clothes, but he is a light sleeper and he keeps his trousers and coat within arm's reach even while in bed. She considers creating some emergency that would require him to leave quickly without securing everything. But she cannot imagine a scenario that would work without endangering her children or drawing unwanted attention from neighbors. She thinks about picking the lock, but she has no tools and no knowledge of such skills. Every plan she devises contains fatal flaws. Too many variables she cannot control. Too many ways Magnus might discover what she is attempting. The arrival of the children forces her to adapt her search strategies. She can no longer spend hours in focused investigation because Kenna and Callum require constant attention. But she discovers that children provide unexpected advantages. They are naturally curious, prone to exploring spaces adults have learned to ignore. She encourages their exploration, subtly directing their attention to trunks and cupboards she has not yet thoroughly examined. When Kenna asks why Mother seems so interested in Father's workshop, Moira deflects with stories about dangerous tools, but she files away the observation that her daughter is perceptive enough to notice patterns in adult behavior. Years pass, and the search becomes something like meditation, a ritual that structures her existence and gives her purpose beyond mere survival. She knows every inch of the cottage, has investigated every possible hiding place multiple times, and has reluctantly concluded that the skin is not in the living spaces. This leaves the workshop, the barn, or somewhere on the property, buried or concealed outdoors. The barn yields nothing despite thorough searches conducted while supposedly gathering eggs or checking on their single cow. The property is too large to excavate systematically without drawing attention, and she has no way of knowing where to dig, even if she had the opportunity. So she focuses on Magnus himself, studying him with the intensity of a hunter learning prey. She notes which days he seems most relaxed, when he drinks enough to dull his vigilance, how his routines shift with seasons and weather. She maps his habits with scientific precision, looking for patterns that might reveal vulnerability. She learns that he checks the workshop more frequently during storms, as if worried about water damage, which confirms her suspicion that the skin is stored there. She observes that he grows careless on holy days when he drinks at the pub with other fishermen, returning home unsteady and less attentive to his usual security measures. Moira begins to implement a long-term strategy of calculated performance. She becomes gradually more affectionate with Magnus, not enough to seem false, but sufficient to lower his guard incrementally over years. She initiates conversation more often, laughs at his jokes, touches his hand during meals, creates the appearance of a wife who has finally accepted her fate, and perhaps even grown fond of her captor. It costs her something essential to perform this deception, feels like a betrayal of her true self. But she understands that Magnus's confidence is her best weapon. The more secure he feels in her captivity, the more likely he is to make the mistake that will give her the opening she needs. And so, she waits, and searches, and plans, and performs her role with flawless dedication. Every day she maintains the pretense of acceptance. Every night she lies awake calculating probabilities and refining strategies. Every moment she remains conscious of the skin's location, somewhere nearby, calling to her with a voice only she can hear. The search has become her life's work, her reason for enduring, her promise to herself that captivity is temporary no matter how many years it lasts. She will find her skin. She will return to the sea. No matter what she must sacrifice, no matter how long it takes, no matter what she must leave behind when the moment finally comes. The Orkney Islands rise from the North Sea like the broken teeth of some ancient giant. 70 archipelagic fragments of rock and grass and stubborn human persistence. These islands, strung across the waters between Scotland's northern coast and the distant Shetlands, have always existed at the threshold of worlds. Here, the line between myth and history blurs until they become indistinguishable, until the seal swimming past your boat might be exactly what it appears, or might be your great-grandmother returned to check on her descendants. The Orcadians do not speak of the Selkie as legend or folklore. They speak of them as fact, as family, as the complicated truth that runs through their bloodlines like salt water through their veins. Travel to any of the inhabited islands, sit in any pub where the old folk gather, and ask about the Selkie. You will not receive the dismissive smiles or embarrassed deflections that such questions might provoke elsewhere. Instead, you will hear names and dates, specific locations and family trees, accounts delivered with the matter-of-fact tone reserved for discussing weather or fishing yields. The Orcadians will tell you about the Sinclair family of Westray, who claim descent from a Selkie woman taken by an ancestor 5 generations back. They will point out certain features that supposedly mark this heritage: webbed toes that appear in every third child, an uncanny ability to predict storms, eyes that reflect light oddly in certain angles. One of the most famous Orcadian tales centres on the island of Stronsay, in a small settlement called Rothisholm. The story dates to the early 1700s, recorded in parish records and family Bibles, with the kind of bureaucratic precision that makes dismissal difficult. A fisherman named John Spence discovered a Selkie woman on the beach at dawn, already transformed and searching frantically for her skin. Unlike Magnus in our archetypal tale, Spence did not steal the skin through stealth. He found it lying on the rocks, picked it up out of curiosity, and only realized what he held when the woman approached him with tears streaming down her face, begging in a mixture of incomprehensible sounds and broken Scots for its return. Spence, by all accounts, a practical man unused to denying requests from weeping women, nearly gave the skin back. But his mother, an elderly widow who lived with him, saw the Selkie and immediately recognized an opportunity. She convinced her son that this beautiful creature could be his wife, could bear him children, could end his lonely bachelorhood. She promised to hide the skin where it would never be found, swore that the Selkie would grow content with time. Spence, weak-willed or desperately lonely or simply tired of arguing with his formidable mother, agreed. The skin disappeared into the old woman's keeping, and the Selkie became Mrs. Spence, a title that must have tasted like ashes on her tongue. The marriage lasted 7 years and produced 4 children, 3 sons and a daughter, all of whom bore the telltale signs: webbed digits, unusually large eyes, and that peculiar affinity for water. The Selkie wife, whose name was recorded in the church register as Margaret, though surely that was not her true name, performed her duties with the same distant competence we have seen in Moira's story. But the old woman, Spence's mother, grew to regret her role in the captivity. As she aged and illness took hold, she experienced what the records describe as terrible nightmares, visions of drowning, and an overwhelming conviction that she had committed a sin beyond redemption. On her deathbed, the mother confessed to Margaret where the skin was hidden, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in a stone cairn on the western headland, marked by 3 white stones arranged in a triangle. She begged forgiveness with her dying breath, though whether she received it, the records do not say. Margaret waited until the funeral was complete, until John Spence and the neighbours were occupied with the wake, and then she walked to the western headland. She found the cairn exactly as described, pulled away the stones with hands that left bloody prints on the granite, and retrieved the bundle that contained her freedom. What happened next is where the story becomes truly devastating in its details. Margaret did not flee immediately to the sea, She returned to the cottage where her 4 children slept, stood over their beds for what neighbours later said must have been an hour, and wept silently while they dreamed. When John Spence finally noticed her absence and came looking, he found her on the doorstep, already wearing her seal skin, transformation half complete. She spoke to him in human speech one final time, told him to raise their children with kindness, told him she had tried to love him but could not, because love cannot exist without freedom. Then she completed the transformation and vanished into the waves, leaving John Spence to collapse on his doorstep and weep like a child. The descendants of John Spence and the Selkie Margaret still live on Stronsay, still bear the marks of their unusual heritage, still tell the story with a mixture of pride and sorrow. They are not the only such family in Orkney. The islands are full of similar lineages, similar tales of capture and loss, similar markers of seal blood in human veins. The Orcadians have incorporated this history into their identity, understanding themselves as a people who exist at the intersection of human and other, land and sea, captivity and freedom. They know these stories are not comfortable, do not have happy endings, do not resolve into neat moral lessons. But they tell them anyway, passing them down through generations, because to forget would be to lose something essential about who they are and where they come from. The Selkie is not external to Orcadian identity. She is woven into it, a thread of wildness and sorrow that can never be fully untangled from the fabric of their existence. North of Orkney, where the North Sea meets the Atlantic in a collision of currents and rage, the Shetland Islands stand like sentinels at the edge of the known world. These are Britain's most remote inhabited lands, closer to Norway than to London, shaped by Viking settlement and Norse mythology in ways that make them distinct from the Scottish mainland. Here, the Selkie stories take on different textures, incorporate elements of Nordic tradition, and reveal variations that complicate the simple narrative of female victims and male captors. In Shetland, the seal folk are both predator and prey, both captor and captive, reflecting a more complex understanding of the relationship between human and other. The Shetlandic term for these beings is not Selkie, but Selkie folk, or sometimes simply the Seal people, spoken in a dialect that carries echoes of Old Norse mixed with Scots. The islanders describe them as an entire society existing parallel to human civilization, with their own hierarchies, customs, and moral codes. They are not simply magical animals that occasionally take human form, but rather a fully realized alternative humanity that happens to wear seal skin as their primary mode of existence. This distinction matters because it shifts the Selkie from creature to person, from thing that can be possessed to autonomous being, whose captivity becomes even more clearly a crime. Shetland's tales include a significant number of stories about male Selkies, a variation less common in Orkney or the Hebrides. These male Selkie are described as devastatingly handsome in human form, with dark liquid eyes and voices like the music of deep water. They come ashore not by accident but by choice, seeking encounters with human women, offering romance and often fathering children before vanishing back into the sea. These stories carry an element of fantasy fulfillment, offering isolated island women a mythological explanation for desire, for transgression, for children born outside sanctioned marriage. But beneath the romantic gloss, they also reveal something darker, the male Selkie as seducer and abandoner, the mirror image of the male fisherman as captor. One famous Shetland tale from the island of Unst tells of a young woman named Geoga who encountered a male Selkie on the beach at Burrowfirth. She was newly married to a man she did not love, bound by arrangement rather than affection, trapped in her own kind of captivity. The Selkie appeared to her on Midsummer Night, already in human form, impossibly beautiful, and speaking in honeyed words about freedom and the vast world beyond her small island existence. They met repeatedly over the course of that summer, always at the beach, always under moonlight. Gioga fell desperately in love, began to neglect her duties, started speaking about leaving her husband and disappearing into the sea. But when autumn came and Gioga discovered she was pregnant, the Selkie did not offer to take her with him as she had hoped. Instead, he explained with apparent regret that human women cannot survive the transformation, cannot live in the deep ocean even if they love a Selkie with all their heart. He told her she must return to her husband, raise the child as human, and forget their summer romance. Then, he transformed back into seal form and vanished into the waves, leaving Gioga weeping on the shore. She returned to her husband, who accepted the child as his own, either through ignorance or willful blindness, and raised a daughter who bore all the markers of Selkie heritage. The story is told as romance, as tragedy, as proof of the seal folk's existence. But it is also, fundamentally, another tale of abandonment, of freedom exercised selfishly, of the powerful departing and leaving the powerless to deal with consequences. Shetland also preserves stories of entire communities of seal folk living in underwater halls, kingdoms beneath the waves with architecture of coral and pearl, ruled by kings and queens of ancient lineage. These submarine kingdoms are described with surprising specificity. Great halls lit by bioluminescent creatures, treasures salvaged from shipwrecks, councils where the oldest and wisest seal folk debate matters of law and custom. Humans who see these kingdoms, always by accident and always briefly, describe them as more beautiful and more terrible than anything on land. The implication is clear. The Selkie who walks on land is a visitor from a civilization as complex and ancient as our own, perhaps more so. This understanding makes the theft of a Selkie woman's skin even more heinous in Shetlandic tradition. You are not simply capturing an unusual creature, but kidnapping a citizen of another nation, forcing her into exile, creating an act of violence that reverberates through two worlds. Some Shetland tales speak of retaliation, of male Selkies coming ashore to steal human children in exchange for their captured kin, of storms that destroy the boats of men known to have taken seal wives, of curses that follow families for generations. These elements of consequence and cosmic justice are more pronounced in Shetland than elsewhere, suggesting a culture that understood the moral weight of these stories more explicitly. Yet despite this understanding, the pattern persists across Shetland's history. Parish records and family genealogies document dozens of marriages between fishermen and unusually beautiful women who appeared from nowhere, women who never quite fit into island society, women who eventually vanished back to the sea, leaving behind children and bewildered husbands. The Shetlanders know these stories, claim these lineages, point to physical markers in living people as proof of seal blood. They are proud of this heritage and troubled by it in equal measure, caught between celebrating their unique identity and acknowledging the violence that created it. The Selkie is woven into Shetland's sense of itself, a symbol of isolation, of connection to the sea, of the price paid for living at the edge of the world, where normal rules dissolve and anything becomes possible. The Outer Hebrides stretch along Scotland's western edge like a broken necklace of stone and peat, battered by Atlantic storms that approach with the force of divine judgment. These islands, Lewis and Harris, North and South Uist, Benbecula and Barra, are among the most remote and isolated communities in the British Isles, places where Gaelic remains the first language and the old ways persist with a tenacity that borders on defiance. Here, the Selkie stories take on their darkest hues. incorporating elements of revenge and supernatural consequence that suggest a culture less willing to romanticize the violence of capture and more inclined to encode warnings about the price of transgression. In Hebridean tradition, the Selkie is known as the Maidien Mhara, the Maiden of the Sea, though the term carries connotations absent from its literal translation. The Gaelic language, with its layers of meaning and its intimate connection to landscape and mythology, describes these beings with a specificity that English cannot quite capture. They are not simply seal women, but beings who embody the boundary between elements, who carry the ocean's memory in their blood, who serve as intermediaries between the human world and the vast consciousness of the sea itself. To harm a Selkie, in Hebridean understanding, is not merely to wrong an individual, but to offend the ocean, and the ocean has long memory and infinite patience for revenge. The islands preserve stories where the theft of a seal skin leads not to domestic tranquility, however false, but to immediate and terrible consequences. One tale from the island of South Uist tells of a fisherman named Alistair who stole a Selkie's skin and forced her into marriage. Unlike the resigned acceptance seen in other versions, this Selkie fought constantly, refused to perform wifely duties, spoke in curses that made the neighbours cross themselves, and wept so loudly and constantly that no one in the village could sleep. Alistair beat her, which only intensified her resistance. He locked her in their cottage, which led to her nearly destroying it in her fury. Finally, desperate and exhausted, he returned her skin after only 3 months of this nightmare marriage. She transformed immediately and vanished into the waves, but not before laying a curse on him, that the fish would avoid his nets and the sea would claim his son. The curse, according to the story, manifested exactly as promised. Alistair's fishing yields dropped to nothing despite his skill and effort. He fathered 2 sons with a human woman he married years later, and both drowned in separate accidents before reaching manhood, pulled under by inexplicable currents in calm water. The tale is told as a warning. The Selkie may appear vulnerable on land, but she carries the power of the ocean within her, and that power will find ways to manifest, even through the barriers of captivity. You cannot steal from the sea without the sea eventually collecting its debt. Another Hebridean variation involves the concept of the Seal King, a powerful male Selkie who rules over his kind and who takes personal interest in the fate of his subjects. Stories from Lewis describe this king appearing to men who have captured Selkie wives, offering bargains or delivering threats, promising terrible retribution if the stolen skins are not returned. In one particularly detailed account, the Seal King is described as massive even in human form, with eyes like storm clouds and a voice that sounds like breaking waves. He appears in the dreams of a man named Tormod, who had taken a Selkie wife, showing him visions of drowning, of being pulled down into cold darkness, of his children transforming into seals and abandoning human life entirely. The psychological torture continues until Tormod, broken and terrified, returns the skin and begs forgiveness. These darker Hebridean tales reflect a culture deeply attuned to the dangers of the sea and respectful of its power. The islanders understood, perhaps better than their counterparts in Orkney or Shetland, that the ocean was not simply a resource to be exploited, but a living force with its own agency, its own rules, its own capacity for judgment. The Selkie, as a being of the sea, partook of that power. To capture one was not a romantic adventure, or even a morally ambiguous act of desperation, but a fundamental violation of the natural order that would inevitably result in catastrophe. Yet even in the Hebrides, the stories acknowledge the terrible allure of the Selkie, the temptation that drives men to risk divine retribution. The descriptions of Selkie beauty in Gaelic accounts are among the most elaborate and poetic in all the tradition. They speak of skin like foam on moonlight, hair like seaweed silk, voices that sound like the song's whales sing in the deep places, movements that flow like current. They describe the Selkie's presence as creating a kind of enchantment, making men forget their faith, their families, their very names. This is not to excuse the theft, but to explain it as something beyond simple loneliness or desire. The Selkie represents everything the islands are not: freedom, beauty, belonging to something vast and eternal. To capture one is to attempt to possess the ocean itself, to chain the horizon, to own something that by its very cannot be owned. The Hebridean tales also preserve more examples of seal revenge enacted not by supernatural means, but by the seal folk themselves. There are accounts of groups of seals attacking boats belonging to men known to have taken seal wives, ramming them until they capsize, dragging the occupants under. Stories tell of seal hunters finding their catches mysteriously destroyed, their equipment broken, their nets shredded by what appear to be deliberate acts of sabotage. Whether these events are literally true or symbolic expressions of guilt and fear, they reveal a culture that understood the Selkie not as helpless victims, but as members of a community capable of collective action and vengeance. The message is clear. The seal folk remember their stolen kin, mourn their loss, and will extract whatever justice they can manage against those who violate the ancient laws that govern the boundary between human and seal, land and sea, captivity and freedom. 7 years have passed since Magnus brought Moira to his cottage. 7 years of searching and waiting and performing the role of dutiful wife. The children are older now. Kenna 9 years old and Callum 5, both marked with their heritage and both loved with a fierceness that tears at Moira's heart every time she contemplates what she knows she must eventually do. Magnus has grown comfortable in his possession, confident that time has erased Moira's longing for the sea, that maternal love has domesticated whatever wildness she once possessed. This confidence, this complacency, built from years of successful captivity, will be his undoing. It always is in these stories, because captors inevitably forget that patience is also a form of resistance, that apparent acceptance can mask undiminished determination, that some hungers never fade, no matter how long they are denied. The moment comes on an autumn evening when Magnus returns from 3 days at sea, exhausted from storm fighting and successful fishing, his boat laden with catch that will need to be processed immediately. He is distracted by the work ahead, by the need to salt and smoke fish before they spoil, by the promise of good income that will carry them through winter. Moira sees the distraction in his movements, the way his mind is already in the smokehouse calculating how much salt he will need, how long the smoking will take. She has been watching for exactly this kind of moment for 7 years, has planned for it with the strategic precision of a general planning a campaign, and she recognizes that opportunity has finally arrived. Magnus goes directly to the workshop after unloading the boat, calls to Moira that he will be working late into the night, tells her not to wait up for him. She acknowledges with the same quiet compliance she has shown for 7 years, settles the children for the evening, and then begins the most dangerous gamble of her captivity. She knows the skin is in the workshop, has known for years based on Magnus's protective behavior around that space. She knows he carries the key on a chain around his neck, checks it compulsively, even when distracted. But she also knows that when Magnus works with fish, when he is gutting and cleaning and processing, he removes his shirt to avoid ruining it with blood and scales. and when he removes his shirt, he hangs it on a peg by the door, within reach, but not on his person. She waits until full darkness, until she can see lamplight spilling from the workshop windows and hear the rhythmic sounds of Magnus working. She moves through shadow with the silence she learned in 7 years of searching, approaches the workshop from the side where the windows do not face, where Magnus's attention will be focused on his work rather than on potential intrusion. Through a gap in the wooden walls, she can see him bent over his work table, shirt indeed hanging on its peg, his hands bloody to the wrists as he processes fish with practiced efficiency. She watches him for long minutes, timing his movements, waiting for the moment when he is most deeply focused on his task. When that moment comes, she moves with speed that surprises even herself. The workshop door is not locked from inside because Magnus expects no visitors and needs to move in and out freely as he carries fish from boat to workspace. She opens it silently, blessing the oil she applied to the hinges weeks ago in preparation for exactly this scenario, and slips inside while Magnus has his back turned. 3 steps to the peg where his shirt hangs. Her hand finds the pocket, feels the hard outline of a key, extracts it with fingers that have somehow stopped shaking despite the terror coursing through her veins. Magnus shifts, starts to turn, and she freezes absolutely still, barely breathing, a shadow among shadows. He mutters something about needing more salt, walks past her so closely she can smell the fish blood on his hands, exits the workshop heading toward the storage shed. The reprieve will last perhaps 90 seconds. Moira does not waste time on fear or doubt. She knows where the skin must be, has deduced it through 7 years of observation and logical elimination. The workshop floor has an area that sounds hollow when walked upon. A section Magnus never places heavy equipment on. A space he occasionally checks, even when he has no other reason to be in the workshop. She moves to that spot, finds the edges of a concealed trapdoor, lifts it to reveal a small cavity beneath. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax, is a bundle that calls to her with a voice beyond sound, beyond language, beyond anything human consciousness can fully process. She lifts the bundle and knows immediately, with absolute certainty, that this is her skin. The moment her hands touch it, even through the wrappings, she feels a completeness she has not experienced in 7 years, a rushing sensation of identity returning like blood to a limb that has been asleep. She clutches it to her chest, turns toward the door, and finds Magnus standing in the entrance watching her with an expression of such profound betrayal and rage that for a moment she almost feels pity. Almost, but not quite, because she remembers 7 years of captivity, remembers the theft that started this nightmare, remembers that his pain is the pain of a thief losing stolen property, rather than the pain of genuine loss. He moves to block the door, raising his hands as if he can physically prevent what is about to happen. He speaks her name, pleads with her to think of the children, tells her he loves her, promises anything if she will only stay. His words wash over her like water, meaningless sounds that have no power to change what she must do. She walks toward him steadily, still clutching the bundle, and he realizes with dawning horror that she will not be stopped, that all his planning and hiding and years of careful vigilance have come to nothing. He grabs for the bundle, trying to wrestle it from her arms, and they struggle in the doorway of the workshop, while the lamp gutters and throws wild shadows on the walls. Moira fights with strength, born of desperation and 7 years of denied identity, and she is winning, pulling the bundle free from his grasping hands, when Kenna's voice cuts through the night, calling for her mother, asking what is wrong. Why is father shouting? The sound of her daughter's voice breaks something in Moira that 7 years of captivity could not touch. She turns from Magnus, still clutching the wrapped bundle, and sees Kenna standing in the doorway of the cottage, backlit by the hearth fire, her two large eyes reflecting lamplight in that uncanny way that marks her heritage. Little Callum peers around his sister's legs, confused and frightened by the shouting, by his mother's wild appearance, by the wrongness that children sense even when they cannot name it. For a moment that stretches into eternity, Moira stands frozen between two impossible choices. The sea that calls to her with the voice of her truest self, and the children who carry her blood and her love and her guilty tenderness. She knows what she will choose even before the thought fully forms. She has always known, though she tried not to acknowledge it during the long years of searching. The Selkie always returns to the sea, not because she does not love her children, not because maternal bonds mean nothing to her kind, but because the alternative is a slow death of the spirit that serves no one. To remain on land, even for love of her children, would be to continue the lie of her humanity, to model for them a life of captivity and self-denial, to teach them that love means sacrificing your essential. She cannot do it, will not do it, must not do it, no matter how her heart fractures at the understanding of what she is about to do. She walks toward her children, with the bundle still clutched to her chest. Magnus shouts behind her, threatens to destroy the skin, to burn it, but they both know he will not. His power over her is broken the moment her hands touched what was stolen, and he lacks the cruelty, or perhaps simply the speed, to make good on his threat before she reaches the water. She kneels before Kenna and Callum, brings herself to their eye level, and tries to find words that will make this comprehensible, that will soften what cannot be softened, that will give them something to hold on to in the years of confusion and pain that will follow this night. She tells them she loves them. She tells them they are beautiful and strong and marked with a heritage that makes them special, that connects them to the vast world of the ocean, even though they must live their lives on land. She tells them to watch for seals when they walk the shore, to remember that their mother will always be nearby, always watching over them, even if she cannot embrace them or speak to them or dry their tears. She tells them this is not their fault, that they did nothing wrong, that she is leaving, not because of anything they are or are not, but because she was never meant to live the life Magnus forced upon her. The words feel inadequate, even as she speaks them, like trying to explain color to someone born blind. But she must try because the alternative is to vanish without explanation, to abandon them with nothing but questions that will poison their entire lives. Kenna, who has always been too perceptive, too knowing, nods slowly as if she has been waiting for this moment, as if some part of her has always understood that Mother was not fully present, not fully theirs, not fully human. She asks only one question, in a voice small and breaking. Will you come back? Moira wants to lie, wants to promise return and reunion and the comfort of maternal presence, but she cannot. She will not build their hope on deception. She tells her daughter the truth. No, she will not come back, cannot come back, because the land is poison to her soul, and remaining here would kill everything she truly is. But she promises to watch, to remain as close as the boundary between worlds allows, to love them from the distance. That is the only honest relationship she can offer. Callum does not understand the words, but understands the tone, understands that Mother is leaving, and he begins to cry with the uncomprehending sorrow of a child losing something he lacks the vocabulary to name. Moira embraces both children, holds them tight enough to imprint their shapes into her memory, breathes in their scent of sleep and childhood and the particular smell that is uniquely theirs. She rocks them for a moment that is both too long and far too short, and then she stands, gently detaches their clinging hands, and walks toward the shore before her resolve can crumble beneath the weight of their need. Magnus follows, still pleading, offering bargains that grow increasingly desperate. He promises to give her more freedom, to never hide the skin again, to let her visit the sea whenever she wishes if only she will stay with their children. He swears he will be a better husband, more attentive, more understanding. He claims the children need their mother, that she is condemning them to half-lives by abandoning them, that maternal duty requires her sacrifice. But Moira walks steadily toward the water, his words falling away behind her like shed clothing. She reaches the edge of the waves. Tears open the oilcloth, wrapping with hands that shake with eagerness, and pulls out the seal skin that has haunted her dreams for 7 endless years. The skin unfolds in her hands, still supple and perfect despite its imprisonment, still carrying the smell of deep ocean and the texture of freedom. She looks back once, sees her children silhouetted in the cottage doorway with their father now standing behind them, his hands on their shoulders, in a gesture that is both protective and possessive. She sees Kenna raise one hand in farewell, a gesture of release that is more mature and gracious than any 9-year-old should be capable of. She sees Callum still crying, reaching toward her with grasping hands. She memorizes this final image of them because she knows it will have to sustain her for whatever eternity awaits. And then she turns her back on land and family and the lie she's lived for 7 years. The transformation, when it comes, is not graceful. She pulls the skin over her shoulders with movements made clumsy by emotion and 7 years of disuse, and her body fights the change at first, having adapted however reluctantly to human form. But then the skin settles into place, and memory floods through her like cold water, and she remembers what she is, what she has always been beneath the performance of humanity. Her form shifts and flows, bones realigning, muscles reforming, consciousness expanding back into the shape that was stolen from her. She completes the transformation in seconds that feel like hours, and then she is seal again, whole again, herself again for the first time in 7 years. She slides into the waves without looking back, and the sea receives her like a mother welcoming a lost child home. The morning after their mother's departure, Kenna and Callum wake to a cottage that feels emptied of more than just a person. The absence is physical, palpable, a void that extends beyond the unmade bed and the unworn clothes. Magnus sits at the table where he's been sitting all night, his face grey with shock and exhaustion, staring at nothing. He does not know how to explain what has happened, does not possess the vocabulary to make sense of it, even to himself, and so he says nothing when the children emerge from their room. They do not ask questions. Kenna already knows, and Callum is too young to understand that his mother's absence will be permanent rather than temporary. They eat breakfast in silence, and then they walk to the shore as if pulled by instinct, by the genetic memory that runs through their veins like salt water. They see her almost immediately. A seal watches from just beyond the breakers, larger than the others, with markings they somehow recognize despite never having seen their mother in seal form. She is close enough that they can see her eyes, those same liquid, oversized eyes that mark them as different from fully human children. She watches them with an intensity that transcends animal curiosity, and Kenna understands with the terrible clarity of a child forced to grow up too quickly that this is as close as they will ever be again. She raises her hand in the same gesture of farewell she gave the night before, and the seal dips beneath the surface, vanishing into the green water. When she surfaces again, she's farther out, and when she dives the second time, she does not return. The years that follow are marked by this pattern of presence and absence, of watching and being watched from across the boundary that can never again be crossed. Kenna and Callum grow up walking the shores obsessively, scanning the water for seals that might be their mother, learning to distinguish her markings from the dozens of other seals that populate these waters. Sometimes they see her, sometimes they imagine they see her, and eventually they lose the ability to distinguish between genuine sighting and desperate hope. But the watching continues because it is all they have, the only connection to the mother who chose freedom over family, the only thread linking them to the heritage that runs through their blood. Magnus tries to be both parents, but he is broken in ways that make adequate parenting impossible. He withdraws into bitterness and silence, speaking only when necessary, working his boat with mechanical precision, but no joy. The neighbors whisper about his wife who disappeared, constructing elaborate theories about where she went and why, never guessing the truth that is simultaneously too fantastic to believe and too obvious to miss. Some suggest she ran away with another man, others that she drowned herself in despair, a few that she simply walked into the sea one night and kept walking. This last theory is closest to the truth, though not in the way they imagine. Magnus tells no one about the seal skin, about the theft that started everything, about the 7 years of captivity that ended in inevitable abandonment. He carries his guilt and rage in silence, and it poisons him slowly from within. Kenna grows into a young woman marked by the same otherworldly beauty as her mother, though muted by her half-human blood. Boys from the village court her, but she rebuffs them all with a coldness that earns her a reputation for being strange, touched, not quite right. She cannot articulate why the thought of marriage and domestic life fills her with suffocating dread. Cannot explain that she sees in every courtship the pattern of her parents' relationship, the cage disguised as home. She spends her days by the water, becomes an expert in seal behavior, learns to move through waves with uncanny skill. The villagers say she is becoming like her mother, though they do not know how literally true this observation is. Callum grows quieter and more withdrawn with each passing year, his childhood memories of maternal warmth fading into uncertainty about whether they were ever real. He develops a fear of the ocean that seems paradoxical given his heritage, refuses to learn to swim, despite living on an island where such skills are essential for survival. He dreams of drowning, of being pulled under by hands that might be helping or harming, of breathing water that burns his lungs like fire. He understands, though he cannot articulate it, that he is being pulled in 2 directions by his split heritage, that the seal blood in his veins calls to the ocean while his human consciousness recoils from it in terror. The internal conflict makes him nervous and jumpy, prone to sudden panics and inexplicable rages. Both children carry the physical markers more prominently as they age. The webbing between their fingers and toes becomes more pronounced, requiring careful hiding and elaborate explanations when noticed. Their eyes grow larger and darker, reflecting light in ways that make people uncomfortable. They can hold their breath for impossible lengths of time, can see clearly underwater without squinting, can sense changes in weather and tide with accuracy that seems supernatural. These abilities mark them as different, as other, as not quite belonging to the human community they must inhabit. They are tolerated, but never fully accepted, included, but always at a distance, treated with the wary courtesy reserved for those who exist at the boundaries of normal. The cruelest aspect of their inheritance is the longing they feel for something they have never truly known. They dream of diving to impossible depths, of swimming with pods of their own kind, of belonging to the vast consciousness of the ocean rather than to the small, constrained world of human society. But they cannot transform, cannot shed their human forms, cannot join their mother in the element that calls to them. They are trapped between worlds with none of the advantages of either. Carrying seal souls in bodies too human to ever be truly free. This is the legacy of the Selkie's captivity. Children who inherit loss and longing, who are marked by heritage they cannot fully claim, who spend their lives watching the water and wondering what might have been if their mother had never been stolen, if their father had never committed the theft that set all of this tragedy in motion. At the heart of every Selkie story lies a question so fundamental, so uncomfortable, that many tellings try to soften it or sidestep it entirely. What do we owe to those we love when their needs conflict with our most essential? The Selkie wife has children who need her, a husband who claims to love her, a community that has accepted her presence, if not her essence. She has built a life on land, however unwillingly, and that life contains genuine relationships, real responsibilities, and bonds that carry moral weight. Yet she abandons it all the moment she reclaims her skin, returns to the sea without hesitation, leaves behind children who will spend their lives processing the trauma of maternal abandonment. Is she a hero reclaiming stolen freedom, or a villain prioritizing her own needs over those of innocent children who did not choose to be born into this impossible situation? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that she is both and neither. The Selkie's choice cannot be judged by conventional moral frameworks because the situation itself exists outside normal parameters. She did not choose marriage, did not consent to motherhood, did not willingly enter into any of the relationships that are now used to justify her continued captivity. Every bond that ties her to land was forged through the original crime of the skin's theft, built on a foundation of violence, however domestic and normalized it may appear. To argue that she should remain for her children's sake is to argue that the consequences of being victimized create obligations to continue accepting victimization. That love generated through captivity carries the same moral weight as love freely chosen. Consider the alternative for a moment. Imagine Moira staying on land, subordinating her to her children's needs, spending the rest of her life in the slow suffocation of wrong embodiment. What kind of mother would she be? What lessons would her children learn from watching her gradual, spiritual death? They would learn that identity is negotiable, that selfhood can be sacrificed for others' comfort, that love means accepting whatever cage you are placed in. They would internalize the message that some people exist to serve others' needs, regardless of the cost to their own souls. This is not a lesson worth teaching, not a model worth providing, not a legacy worth leaving. The Selkie who stays becomes a ghost haunting her own life, present in body but absent in every way that matters, and her children would grow up with that ghostly presence rather than the clean break of abandonment. But acknowledging the impossibility of her staying does not erase the very real harm her departure causes. Kenna and Callum are genuinely traumatized by maternal abandonment, genuinely harmed by growing up without the mother they loved and needed. Their suffering is real, their loss is profound, and their lifelong struggle with identity and belonging is a direct consequence of their mother's choice. The Selkie's freedom comes at a terrible price, and that price is paid primarily by people who bear no responsibility for the original crime. This is the tragedy's core. There is no resolution that does not create victims, no choice that does not generate harm, no outcome that can be called just in any conventional sense. The myth acknowledges this through its refusal to provide easy answers or comfortable resolutions. The Selkie does not return periodically to check on her children in ways that might soften the abandonment. She does not find some magical middle ground where she can be both seal and mother, both free and present. She makes a hard choice and lives with its consequences, just as her children must live with those same consequences. The stories do not excuse her choice or condemn it, do not present it as either heroic or monstrous. They simply present it as inevitable, as the only possible outcome once the theft occurred, as the natural consequence of trying to cage something that was never meant to be caged. This inevitability reveals the myth's true judgment. The crime is not the Selkie's departure, but the fisherman's theft. The moment Magnus stole Moira's skin, he set in motion a sequence of events that could only end in loss and trauma. The captivity itself is the violence, not the escape from captivity. The 7 years of false domesticity are the crime against, not the return to her true form. Everything that follows, all the suffering endured by children and husband, flows directly from that initial act of theft. Magnus's loneliness does not justify it. His love does not excuse it. His provision of material comfort does not balance the scales. He stole a conscious being's identity and agency, forced her into relationships she did not choose, and then claimed moral authority to demand her continued captivity based on bonds created through that theft. The Selkie myth, in its deepest reading, is not about the conflict between freedom and family, but about the impossibility of building anything genuine on a foundation of theft and coercion. Love cannot exist without freedom. Relationships cannot be authentic without consent. Family bonds created through captivity are tainted at their source, no matter how much genuine affection develops over time. The Selkie's inevitable departure is not a failure of maternal love, but proof that some violations are so fundamental, they poison everything built upon them. You cannot steal someone's identity and then demand they honor the relationships that theft created. You cannot force captivity and then claim the moral high ground when the captive escapes captive. This is why the stories are told and retold across centuries, why they persist in cultures that have largely abandoned other aspects of their folklore. The Selkie myth encodes a truth we need to hear, that freedom is not negotiable, that identity cannot be stolen without consequences, that some boundaries must not be crossed no matter how lonely we are or how much we desire what we cannot rightfully have. The tragedy of the abandoned children serves not to condemn the Selkie, but to illustrate the full cost of the fisherman's crime. He did not simply wrong the Selkie when he stole her skin. He wronged his future children by ensuring they would grow up with a mother who could never truly be present, who would eventually have to choose between slow spiritual death and abandonment. The children are victims not of their mother's selfishness, but of their father's crime, casualties of a theft that happened before they were born. The sealskin is not a coat. This bears repeating because the metaphor is easy to misunderstand, easy to dismiss as mere folklore embellishment. When we hear that the fisherman steals the Selkie's skin, we might imagine something equivalent to taking someone's clothing, an inconvenience certainly, but not a fundamental violation of selfhood. This interpretation misses the profound horror at the myth's center. The skin is identity itself, the physical manifestation of what the Selkie truly is. To steal it is not to leave someone naked, but to sever them from their essential, to trap them in a form that is fundamentally wrong, to create a disconnection between self and body so complete that every moment of existence becomes a form of torture. Imagine waking tomorrow in a body that is not yours, that moves wrong, breathes wrong, perceives the world through senses that feel dulled and distorted. Imagine looking in a mirror and seeing a stranger, a form that others insist is you, but that you know with absolute certainty is a cage, a prison, a lie. Imagine this wrongness persisting not for hours or days, but for years, for decades, for the rest of your life, with no possibility of correction. Imagine being told that you should accept this wrong body, should build a life in it, should even be grateful for it because others prefer you this way. This is what the Selkie experiences every moment she remains on land without her skin. The human form may be objectively beautiful, may function perfectly well by human standards, but it is not her, will never be her, and existing within it is a constant low-grade agony, that can never be escaped or forgotten. The theft of the skin, then, is not comparable to property crime or even kidnapping in the conventional sense. It is identity theft in the most literal and devastating meaning of that term. Magnus does not simply take Moira's possession when he steals her skin. He takes her selfhood, her agency, her fundamental right to exist in the form that matches her consciousness. He forces her into a body and a life that are alien to her, and then he builds a relationship on that forced transformation, expecting her gratitude and love while holding the key to her true self as collateral. The violence of this act cannot be overstated, and the fact that it is portrayed in many versions as romantic or understandable reveals how comfortable we are with narratives where male desire justifies female violation. The skin also represents belonging in ways that go beyond individual identity. When the Selkie wears her skin, she is part of a community, a culture, a civilization that exists parallel to human society. She has family among the seal folk, friends and relations who know her true name, and true. She has a place in the complex social structures that govern her kind, a role and status and history that extend back through generations. The theft of the skin severs all of these connections, exiles her not just from her element, but from her people. She becomes a refugee in a foreign land, unable to speak her true language or practice her true customs, forced to assimilate into a culture that can never fully accept her because it can never fully understand what she is, fully. This forced assimilation carries echoes of very real historical atrocities. The Celtic myth emerged from cultures that understood colonization, forced conversion, and cultural genocide, even if they did not use those modern terms. The stories encode memories of people being forced to abandon their languages, their religions, their ways of life, being told that this forced transformation was for their own good, that they should be grateful for civilization, even as it destroyed everything that made them who they were. The Selkie's captivity becomes a metaphor for any situation where power is used to force conformity, where difference is treated as something to be corrected rather than respected, where the powerful assume the right to reshape the powerless according to their own desires and needs. The fact that the Selkie is almost always female in the traditional stories adds another layer of meaning. The theft of the skin becomes a metaphor for the historical treatment of women's autonomy, for marriages built on economic necessity rather than genuine choice, for the legal frameworks that treated women as property that could be transferred from father to husband. The fishermen stealing the skin mirrors, the social structures that denied women the right to refuse marriage, to own property, to make decisions about their own bodies and lives. The skin, hidden away, represents women's agency locked in legal codes and religious doctrines that men controlled. The Selkie's search for her stolen skin parallels women's long struggle to reclaim rights and autonomy that were never legitimately taken in the first place. But the metaphor extends beyond gender to speak to anyone who has experienced having their identity denied, their pathologized, their true self treated as something shameful that must be hidden or corrected. The Selkie forced to wear human form and perform human life speaks to anyone who has had to mask their authentic self to survive in a hostile society. Anyone who has been told that who they are is wrong and must be changed. The skin, as the physical representation of true self, resonates with anyone who understands the exhaustion of constant performance, the grief of disconnection from authentic identity, the longing for a place where you can exist without pretense or apology. The power of the metaphor lies in its physicality. The skin exists, can be touched and held and hidden and found. The Selkie's true is not abstract or theoretical, but materially real, making the theft concrete rather than philosophical. You cannot argue that the Selkie should simply choose to accept human form, cannot claim that identity is merely a matter of perspective or attitude. The skin exists, and without it, she is incomplete. This physicality makes the violation undeniable, the crime impossible to rationalize away. Magnus holds in his hands the proof of what he has stolen, carries the evidence of his crime on a chain around his neck. And when Moira finally reclaims it, when she finally touches her true self after 7 years of forced exile, the transformation is immediate and inevitable because you cannot deny the truth of who you are once you have held it in your hands again. To understand why the Selkie myth persists with such power across centuries, we must place it in the context of the historical realities of women's lives in Scotland and Ireland, particularly in the remote island communities where these stories flourished. These were societies where marriage was often an economic transaction rather than a romantic choice, where women had virtually no legal rights independent of their fathers or husbands, where the concept of marital consent as we understand it today simply did not exist. A woman might be married to settle a debt, to forge an alliance between families, to secure land rights, or simply because a man decided she would be his wife and had the social power to make that decision stick. Her desires, her preferences, her sense of her own identity were irrelevant to the process. In Scottish common law, until well into the 19th century, a married woman had no legal existence separate from her husband. She could not own property, could not enter into contracts, could not even claim legal custody of her own children. The marriage ceremony transferred her from her father's ownership to her husband's, a transaction reflected in the language used. She was given away, taken in marriage, possessed as surely as any other property. If she fled an unhappy marriage, her husband had the legal right to forcibly retrieve her, and the community would support his claim because marriage was understood as a binding contract that could not be broken by one party's change of heart. Divorce was virtually impossible for all but the wealthy, and even when obtained, it left women destitute and socially ostracized. The Selkie story emerges from this context as a fantasy of escape that acknowledges the impossibility of conventional escape. A woman trapped in an unwanted marriage had no legal recourse, no social support for leaving, no economic means of independent survival. But a Selkie wife has something her fully human counterpart lacks: a material proof of her fundamental otherness, a physical object that represents her right to an entirely different existence. The sealskin functions as a kind of divine permission slip, a supernatural justification for breaking bonds that society insisted were unbreakable. The Selkie can leave not because she chooses personal happiness over duty, not because she prioritizes herself over her children, but because she is literally not human and therefore not bound by human rules. The magic of the transformation provides moral cover for an action that would otherwise be condemned as the ultimate feminine transgression. The stories were told primarily by women, passed down through generations of mothers and grandmothers, aunts and neighbors, in the liminal spaces where women gathered away from male authority. These were not official histories recorded in books or preached from pulpits, but oral traditions preserved in kitchens and around hearthfires, in the moments between work and sleep when women had brief respite from the demands of their lives. The Selkie tales allowed these women to articulate desires and resentments that could not be spoken directly, to imagine escape without being accused of encouraging wifely disobedience, to give voice to the suffocation of forced domesticity while maintaining the pretense of accepting their roles. Notice how the stories encode both the desire for escape and the guilt that accompanies that desire. The Selkie loves her children, grieves leaving them, sometimes watches them from the waves in stories that emphasize her continued maternal feeling. But she leaves anyway, because the alternative is unendurable. This narrative structure allows the female listeners to acknowledge both truths simultaneously: that maternal love is real and powerful, and that it is not always sufficient to make an intolerable situation bearable. The Selkie's departure becomes a way of saying what cannot otherwise be said: that sometimes love is not enough, that sometimes survival requires abandonment, that sometimes the price of maintaining relationships built on captivity is too high to pay. The male Selkie stories, less common but present in the tradition, reveal the flip side of this dynamic. When a Selkie man seduces a human woman and then abandons her, the story often treats this as romantic tragedy rather than moral failing. The woman is not condemned for adultery or for bearing a child outside marriage, but is instead portrayed as having been touched by magic, as having experienced something extraordinary, even if it ended in sorrow. These tales gave women a narrative framework for desire that existed outside the confines of arranged marriage, for passion that was not about duty or obligation, but about genuine attraction and choice. The Selkie lover represents everything the arranged husband is not: chosen rather than imposed, desirable rather than merely acceptable, temporary rather than a life sentence. The historical record preserves hints that Selkie stories sometimes served as actual cover for women who fled marriages, or for children born outside sanctioned relationships. A woman who disappeared from an island community might be said to have been a Selkie who found her skin and returned to the sea, an explanation that saved her family from total disgrace while acknowledging that she was gone and would not return. A child with unusual features or with no acknowledged father might be whispered to have Selkie blood, a story that conferred exotic status rather than the shame of illegitimacy. The myth became a social safety valve, a way of managing situations that otherwise had no acceptable narrative resolution. In this context, the Selkie myth becomes more than entertainment or cultural tradition. It becomes a form of resistance, a way of maintaining the possibility of female autonomy and desire even within social structures designed to eliminate both. The stories insist, against all legal and religious authority, that some women are not bound by the rules that claim to govern all women, that some escapes are legitimate even when they violate every conventional obligation, that freedom is a right that supersedes all other considerations. They preserve, in coded form, the knowledge that marriage based on theft and coercion is not sacred, that maternal love does not erase all other needs, that survival sometimes requires breaking bonds that society insists are eternal and unbreakable. In the 21st century, in the age of smartphones and satellite internet reaching even the most remote islands, the Selkie stories persist. They are still told in the Orkney Islands, in Shetland, in the Outer Hebrides, passed from grandmother to grandchild, recounted in schools and community centres, performed by local theatre groups and folk musicians. This persistence is remarkable not because the stories have remained unchanged, frozen in some imagined authentic form, but because they continue to evolve, to adapt, to serve the needs of each generation that inherits them. The oral tradition is not a museum preservation of dead artifacts, but a living practice, and the Selkie remains alive within it, because she continues to speak to something essential in human experience. The mechanics of oral tradition are worth understanding because they reveal why these stories survive when so much else has been lost. Unlike written texts, which fix a story in a single authoritative version, oral tradition exists in constant flux. Each teller brings their own emphasis, their own interpretations, their own additions and subtractions based on what resonates with their particular audience. A grandmother telling the story to her grandchildren might emphasize the Selkie's love for her children and the tragedy of necessary separation. A young woman telling the same story to her friends might focus on the theft and captivity, on the violation of consent, on the Selkie's determination to reclaim her stolen identity. A fisherman might tell it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to possess what should remain free. All of these are the Selkie story. All are authentic. All preserve the essential truth, even as they shift emphasis and detail. This flexibility is not a weakness, but a strength. It allows the myth to remain relevant across changing social contexts, to speak to new situations while maintaining its core meaning. In the 1800s, when the stories were first being collected by folklorists, they might have emphasized wifely duty and maternal sacrifice, reflecting Victorian values about women's proper roles. In the mid-20th century, as women gained more legal rights and social autonomy, the same stories began to be told with greater emphasis on the Selkie's right to freedom, on the illegitimacy of the theft. Today, in an era of increased awareness about consent, autonomy, and the complexities of identity, the stories resonate with new layers of meaning while still carrying forward the essential truths that made them powerful centuries ago. The islands where these stories originated remain small, isolated communities where everyone knows everyone else, where family connections stretch back generations, where oral culture still functions as a primary means of transmitting community knowledge and values. In these settings, to tell a Selkie story is not merely to entertain, but to participate in the ongoing construction of collective identity. The stories remind listeners that they come from a place where the boundary between human and other was always permeable, where the sea was both provider and threat, where identity itself was understood as more fluid and mysterious than modern rationalism allows. To claim Selkie ancestry, as many island families do, is to claim connection to this liminal space, to assert that your people have always understood truths that mainland culture forgot or never knew. The practice of storytelling itself carries meaning beyond the content of individual stories. When an older person tells a Selkie tale to a younger listener, they are not just transmitting information, but enacting a ritual of cultural continuity. They are saying, "This is who we are, this is where we come from, this is what matters to our people." The younger listener who receives the story and later tells it to the next generation becomes a link in a chain that stretches back into unrecorded history. This chain is fragile, dependent on individual humans choosing to remember and retell, vulnerable to the cultural homogenization that modern media encourages. But it persists, and its persistence is a form of resistance against the erasure of local knowledge and particular identity. The oral tradition also preserves elements that written versions often sanitize or remove. The scholarly collections of Selkie tales, compiled by educated folklorists in the 19th and early 20th centuries, tend to soften the story's edges, to make them more palatable for general audiences. They emphasize the romantic and magical elements while downplaying the sexual violence implicit in the theft of the skin, the forced marriage, the years of captivity. But in oral tradition, told within communities that understand the context and the stakes, these darker elements remain. The theft is called what it is: theft. The marriage is understood as coerced. The Selkie's departure is framed not as abandonment, but as escape from captivity. Oral tradition preserves the truth that written versions often obscure. The settings where these stories are told have also adapted to modern life while maintaining traditional function. Stories that might once have been told exclusively around peat fires in crofters' cottages are now shared in community halls, at folk festivals, in school classrooms, and increasingly in online forums where islanders connect with diaspora communities scattered across the globe. A young person from Orkney living in Edinburgh or London might participate in online discussions about Selkie stories, sharing versions they learned from grandparents, connecting with others who claim similar heritage. The medium changes, but the function remains. The stories continue to bind people to place, to history, to a shared understanding of what it means to come from these particular islands, where seal and human worlds intersect. Perhaps most importantly, the oral tradition keeps the Selkie stories participatory rather than passive. When you read a written version, you are consuming a fixed text created by someone else. But when you hear a story told aloud and later retell it yourself, you become part of its evolution. You make choices about what to emphasize, what to leave out, how to adapt it to your audience. You add your own understanding, your own interpretation, your own lived experience to the story's ongoing life. In this way, the oral tradition ensures that the Selkie remains a collective creation rather than an authored text, a community possession rather than individual property, a living tradition rather than a historical artifact. The Selkie has never left us. She surfaces in contemporary literature with remarkable frequency, appearing in novels and short stories that range from faithful retellings to radical reimaginings. She swims through modern poetry, dances across theatre stages, inspires visual artists working in everything from traditional painting to digital media. But her influence extends far beyond explicit adaptations of the myth. The Selkie's essential story, the narrative of stolen identity and inevitable escape, the tragedy of belonging to a world you cannot access, has become a template that echoes through contemporary culture in ways both obvious and subtle. In literature, the Selkie appears in works that span genre and style. Jane Yolen's short story collection explores the myth's feminist dimensions, making explicit what the traditional tales encoded. Margot Lanigan's novel transforms the Selkie story into a meditation on masculinity, desire, and the violence of possession. Juliette Marillier's historical fantasy series incorporates Selkie elements into a broader Celtic mythological framework, while contemporary authors like Karen Russell use the myth as a lens for examining immigration, assimilation, and the cost of cultural erasure. Each adaptation finds new meanings in the ancient pattern while preserving its essential truth: that some identities cannot be negotiated away, that freedom is not a luxury but a necessity, that love built on captivity is fundamentally corrupted. The film industry has discovered the Selkie repeatedly, though cinematic adaptations often struggle with the story's essential darkness. The Secret of Roan Inish, released in 1994, remains perhaps the most successful film adaptation, treating the myth with respect and using it to explore themes of belonging and cultural identity. More recent films have tended toward romantic interpretations that soften the theft and captivity, transforming a story about violation and escape into tales of star-crossed lovers choosing between worlds. These sanitized versions miss the point, but their very existence demonstrates the myth's continued cultural power. Even when misunderstood, the Selkie compels retelling. Music has preserved the Selkie with particular fidelity to the traditional spirit. Celtic musicians and folk singers continue to perform Selkie songs that date back centuries, while contemporary artists compose new works that honor the myth's complexity. These musical versions often emphasize the haunting quality of the story, using minor keys and traditional instrumentation to evoke the cold northern seas and the unbridgeable distance between worlds. The songs keep alive the oral tradition's emphasis on emotion over explanation, allowing listeners to feel the story rather than merely understand it intellectually. Beyond explicit adaptations, the Selkie's narrative structure appears in countless contemporary stories that never mention seals or magical transformations. Any story about someone trapped in the wrong life, forced into an identity that does not fit, desperately searching for the key to their true self, owes something to the Selkie tradition. Stories about transgender individuals reclaiming authentic identity after years of forced performance, echo the Selkie finding her skin. Narratives about immigrants caught between cultures, belonging fully to neither, mirror the half-sealed children watching the ocean. Tales of people escaping abusive relationships, despite the guilt of leaving children behind, follow the same terrible logic as the Selkie's departure. The myth has found particularly powerful resonance in discussions of consent, autonomy, and bodily agency. In an era increasingly attentive to questions of sexual consent and the invalidation of choices made under coercion, the Selkie story provides a mythological framework for understanding these issues. The theft of the skin becomes a metaphor for any situation where consent is manufactured through the removal of alternatives, where agreement is extracted through the manipulation of circumstances. The Selkie's long search for her stolen property mirrors the struggle to reclaim agency after it has been taken, to reconstruct selfhood after violation, to find the strength to escape when escape means losing everything you have built on the ruins of what was stolen. Academic discourse has also embraced the Selkie, with scholars from multiple disciplines finding rich material in the myth's complexities. Folklorists trace its variations and evolution, mapping how the story changes across geography and time. Literary critics analyze its narrative structures and symbolic systems, exploring how it functions as text and metatext. Anthropologists examine what it reveals about the cultures that preserved it, the social anxieties it encoded, the desires it allowed expression. Gender studies scholars mine it for insights into historical and contemporary constructions of femininity, sexuality, and agency. Environmental scholars read it as a meditation on humanity's relationship with the natural world, on the boundaries between human and animal, on what we lose when we try to domesticate the wild. The internet age has given the Selkie new platforms and new audiences. Social media communities dedicated to folklore and mythology discuss Selkie stories alongside contemporary social justice issues, drawing explicit connections between the myth and modern struggles for autonomy and recognition. Artists share Selkie-inspired work on platforms that reach global audiences, introducing the Scottish and Irish myth to people who have never seen the North Atlantic, but who recognize immediately the truth it contains. Online forums debate interpretations, share family stories of claimed Selkie ancestry, and argue passionately about the myth's meanings and implications. Perhaps most significantly, the Selkie has become a recognized cultural reference point, a shorthand that carries immediate meaning. To describe someone as having Selkie qualities is to invoke a whole complex of associations: beauty, otherworldliness, fundamental unsuitability for ordinary domestic life, an essential wildness that cannot be tamed. To speak of searching for your sealskin is to communicate a quest for authentic identity, for the key to becoming who you truly are. These references assume shared cultural knowledge, rely on the myth's continued circulation and recognition. The fact that such references work, that they communicate meaning efficiently to diverse audiences, demonstrates that the Selkie remains culturally alive and relevant. We return now to where we began, to the liminal spaces where sea meets shore, where the boundary between worlds grows thin as morning mist. The beaches of Orkney and Shetland and the Hebrides look much as they did centuries ago when the first Selkie stories were told. The same black rocks thrust from grey water, the same cold waves crash against ancient stone. The same seals watch from just beyond the breakers with eyes that might be animal or might be something more. The landscape has not changed, and neither has the essential truth the Selkie embodies: that some boundaries cannot be crossed without violence, that some identities cannot be stolen without consequence, that freedom will always, eventually, find a way to reclaim itself. The Selkie is not a comfortable myth. It offers no easy resolutions, no happy endings where everyone gets what they want. no compromise that satisfies all parties. It insists, with the cold clarity of northern waters, that some situations have no good options, that sometimes every choice creates victims, that tragedy is not always the result of individual moral failing, but can be baked into circumstances themselves. This discomfort is precisely why the story matters, why it persists, why each generation finds itself compelled to tell it again. We need myths that acknowledge complexity, that refuse to pretend that love conquers all, or that good intentions justify harmful actions. We need stories that look unflinchingly at the cost of captivity and the price of freedom. What the Selkie myth teaches, above all, is that you cannot build genuine relationship on stolen ground. Magnus's error was not in loving Moira, not even in desiring her, but in believing that theft could be transmuted into legitimate possession through time and domesticity. He stole her skin and her agency, forced her into relationships she never chose, and then expected her to honor bonds created through that original violation. His tragedy, and it is a tragedy despite his crime, lies in his failure to understand that love without freedom is not love at all, but a simulation of love, a performance that can be maintained only through continued captivity. The moment Moira reclaimed her skin, the illusion shattered, revealing what had always been true. She was never truly his. Their marriage was never truly valid, and the family they created was built on a foundation of sand that the tide would inevitably reclaim. The children left behind carry the legacy of this impossible situation. They are not responsible for their father's crime or their mother's escape, yet they bear the consequences of both. Their lives are shaped by an abandonment that was simultaneously necessary and devastating, by a loss that was both inevitable and preventable. Had Magnus never stolen the skin, Kenna and Callum would never have been born, which seems like a tragedy in itself. But had he not stolen it, countless other children would have been born to the Selkie in her true form. Children who would have belonged fully to one world, rather than existing in painful suspension between two. There is no version of this story where everyone survives unharmed. No alternate timeline where theft does not create cascading harm. The only moral clarity lies in identifying where the harm originates. Not in the escape, but in the capture. Not in the departure, but in the theft that made departure necessary. Stand on an Orcadian beach at twilight and watch the seals. They surface and dive, existing so completely in their element that it is almost impossible to imagine them in any other form. And yet, the stories insist they can transform, that beneath those sleek seal bodies lies the potential for human shape, human consciousness, human capacity for love and sorrow and the terrible choices that come with both. Whether you believe this literally or metaphorically matters less than understanding what the possibility represents. That the world is stranger and more various than rationalism allows. That identity is more complex and mysterious than biology suggests. That the boundaries we draw between categories are more permeable and provisional than we like to admit. The Selkie swims through our cultural consciousness as a reminder of what we lose when we try to cage the wild, when we attempt to possess what should remain free, when we mistake control for connection. She is the part of ourselves that refuses domestication. The aspect of identity that cannot be negotiated away for comfort or security, or even love. She is the knowledge that some prices are too high to pay, that some cages are too small to survive in, that freedom is not a luxury to be sacrificed for others' needs, but a fundamental requirement of authentic existence. And she is the promise that captivity, no matter how complete it appears, is never permanent, that the true self cannot be destroyed even when it is hidden, that the skin will eventually be found and the return to the sea is inevitable. If you have made it this far in our journey through the Selkie story, you understand now why these myths persist, why they are told and retold across centuries, why they continue to resonate in an age that has largely abandoned belief in magical transformations. The Selkie is not about seals or skins or supernatural metamorphosis. She is about the human experience of captivity and freedom, identity and violation, love and its limitations. She is about the choices we make when all options are terrible, about the consequences that ripple through generations, about the price of trying to possess another soul. And she is about the shore that remembers, the waters that wait, the inevitable return to the element that is your true home, no matter how long you have been kept from it. Thank you for joining us in this exploration of one of mythology's most profound and troubling stories. If these dark northern waters have spoken to something in your soul, if the Selkie song has resonated with your own experience of captivity or freedom or the search for authentic self, then consider subscribing to Echoes of the Old World. We will continue to explore the myths that reveal uncomfortable truths, the stories that refuse easy answers, the folklore that speaks to the complexity of human experience. Until next time, may you find your skin, reclaim your stolen identity, and return to whatever ocean calls your name.